John Mason stared at the letter in his hand for the 5th time that morning. The official county courthouse stamp made his stomach turn. At 43 years old, John never thought he would find himself summoned to court. The traffic ticket from last month seemed minor. He had failed to yield at an intersection, causing a small fender bender with no injuries. But now he had to appear before a judge, and that thought filled him with dread. "It'll be fine," his wife Patricia said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You'll pay the fine and we'll be done with it." John nodded but didn't feel reassured. After 12 years in the Marines and 3 tours in Afghanistan, he had faced dangers most people couldn't imagine. Yet somehow, this courthouse summons made his hands shake. Perhaps it was because in war he knew what to expect. Here in civilian life, the rules still felt foreign to him even 5 years after his discharge. He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Then he gripped the wheels of his chair and pushed himself toward the kitchen table. The wheelchair was a constant reminder of the IED explosion that had sent him home for good. The blast had torn through his legs, leaving him with metal rods, countless scars, and pain that never fully went away. "Did you take your medicine this morning?" Patricia asked, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Yes," John lied. He hated the pills. They made his mind foggy and he needed to be alert for court. The pain would be his companion today, as it had been since that dusty road outside Kabul. Patricia gave him a look that said she didn't believe him, but she didn't push. After 8 years of marriage and 5 years of helping him adjust to life after his injury, she knew when to let things be. "I called Ryan," she said, referring to their neighbor who had offered to drive them to the courthouse. "He'll be here at 9. John nodded and sipped his coffee. Their old truck wasn't equipped for his wheelchair and the bus was too much of a hassle. He hated depending on others, but there was no way around it today. "Did you iron my blue shirt?" he asked. "It's hanging in the bedroom, and I polished your shoes too." John smiled at his wife. Patricia had been his high school sweetheart. They had dated briefly before he joined the Marines, then reconnected when he came home on leave 10 years later. She had been the one constant in his life since the explosion, never once making him feel like a burden despite the challenges of his disability. "What would I do without you?" he asked. "Probably wear wrinkled shirts to court," she joked, but her eyes were soft with love. 2 hours later, Ryan's SUV pulled up to the county courthouse. The building was old and imposing, with stone steps leading up to large wooden doors. John looked at those steps and felt a wave of frustration. Even now, many public buildings remained difficult for him to access. "There's a ramp on the east side," Ryan said, noticing John's expression. "Want me to drive around?" "Please," John replied, grateful for Ryan's understanding. The ramp entrance was less grand but more practical. Patricia helped John navigate into the building, carrying his small bag with his medication and documents. The hallways were crowded with people. Lawyers in suits rushing past, worried-looking citizens waiting on benches, uniformed officers escorting handcuffed individuals. John's wheelchair drew a few glances, but most people were too preoccupied with their own troubles to pay him much attention. That suited him fine. He hated being stared at. They found courtroom 3 and entered through the accessible door at the side. The room was larger than John had expected, with rows of wooden benches, a jury box, empty today, and the judge's bench raised high at the front. The American flag stood to one side and the state flag to the other. "Looks like we're early," Patricia whispered, checking her watch. "Your case is scheduled for 11:30. They found a spot at the end of a row where John could stay in his wheelchair without blocking the aisle. They watched as case after case was called. Some were over in minutes, a plea, a fine assessed, the next case called. Others took longer, with lawyers arguing points of law that John didn't understand. As the clock ticked toward 11:30, John felt his anxiety growing. He had dressed carefully in his blue button-down shirt, navy slacks, and polished shoes. His hair was neatly combed and he had shaved closely that morning. Still, he worried about the impression he would make. Would the judge see him as a responsible citizen who had made a minor mistake, or just as another reckless driver? Patricia sensed his tension and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Remember what our lawyer said. Just be respectful, Admit to the mistake and it will be over quickly. John nodded. They had consulted with a lawyer friend who had assured them that for a first-time traffic offense, the penalty would likely be just a fine. Still, facing a judge was intimidating. At 11:25, a side door opened and the bailiff entered. "All rise," he called out. "The Honorable Judge Samuel Harris presiding." Everyone in the courtroom stood as the judge entered. Everyone except John, who remained in his wheelchair feeling conspicuous and uncomfortable. Judge Harris was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. He moved with the confidence of someone who had occupied his position for many years. His black robe swirled around him as he took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he said, and the rustling of people returning to their seats filled the room. John had heard about Judge Harris. He had a reputation for being strict but fair, a stickler for procedure and protocol. Some called him the Colonel behind his back, though as far as John knew, the judge had never served in the military. The clerk began calling cases, and John listened as each defendant approached the bench. Judge Harris was indeed formal, addressing each person with cool politeness. He showed little emotion, even when a young woman broke down in tears over a shoplifting charge. By the time the clerk called case number 47293, State versus John Mason, John's mouth was dry with nervousness. Patricia gave his hand one final squeeze before he wheeled himself forward to the defendant's table. "Mr. Mason, you are charged with failing to yield at an intersection on April 15th, resulting in a collision with another vehicle. How do you plead?" Judge Harris asked, looking down at the file rather than at John. "Guilty, Your Honor," John replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Now Judge Harris looked up, his gaze taking in John's wheelchair for the first time. His expression remained neutral. "Can you explain the circumstances of this incident?" the judge asked. John cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. I was turning left at the intersection of Maple and 5th. I thought I had enough time to make the turn before the oncoming car reached the intersection. I misjudged the distance. It was my fault." Judge Harris nodded slightly, making a note in the file. "Any prior traffic violations, Mr. Mason?" "No, Your Honor. This is my first." The judge reviewed the file silently for a moment, then looked up again. "I see the other driver's insurance company has already been compensated for the damage to their vehicle. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. My insurance covered it." Judge Harris seemed satisfied with this. He closed the file and straightened in his chair. "Very well. I'm ready to proceed with sentencing," he announced. Then, following courtroom procedure, he said firmly, "The defendant will rise for sentencing." The courtroom fell silent. John felt heat rising to his face as all eyes turned to him. Patricia, still sitting in the gallery, tensed visibly. "Your Honor," John began quietly, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I'm unable to stand, without assistance. I was injured during my service in Afghanistan." Judge Harris's expression didn't change. His eyes, cold and professional, remained fixed on John as he repeated, "I said, the defendant will rise for sentencing. That is the protocol in my courtroom." The silence in the courtroom deepened. Even the court clerk looked uncomfortable, glancing between the judge and John with concern. John felt a mixture of embarrassment and anger rising in his chest, but years of military discipline kept his face composed. He had faced tougher situations than this proud old judge. Patricia started to rise from her seat, ready to come to her husband's aid, her face flushed with indignation at the judge's insistence. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. John Mason sat in his wheelchair, his face burning with a mixture of shame and anger. Judge Samuel Harris stared down at him from the bench, his expression unchanged as he repeated his command. "Mr. Mason, I have been presiding in this courtroom for 27 years. In my courtroom, defendants stand for sentencing. That is the protocol. That is the respect this court deserves." Patricia was now halfway up the aisle, her face flushed with anger. A murmur ran through the spectators. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her machine. John took a deep breath. He had faced Taliban fighters and survived an IED explosion. He wasn't going to be broken by this man's pride. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached down and unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair. "Very well, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. Patricia reached his side then, whispering urgently, "John, you don't have to do this." But John had already placed his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair and was preparing to push himself up. His face showed the tremendous effort it took. Sweat beaded on his forehead as pain shot through his damaged legs. Before he could rise fully, a man in a gray suit stepped forward from the gallery. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Judge Harris looked irritated at the interruption, but nodded curtly. "Make it quick, Mr. Peters." The man in the gray suit was Alan Peters, a court-appointed attorney who had been observing cases that morning. He hadn't been assigned to John's case, but something about the situation had compelled him to intervene. He approached the bench and spoke in low tones that the rest of the courtroom couldn't hear. "Your Honor, I believe Mr. Mason is a decorated veteran. His injury appears to be service-related. Perhaps in this instance the court might consider—" I'm well aware of what the court might consider, Mr. Peters," Judge Harris interrupted, his voice still low but sharp. "Are you now representing Mr. Mason?" "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then please return to your seat and allow me to conduct my courtroom." Alan Peters looked like he wanted to say more, but years of courtroom experience told him when to back down. He nodded respectfully and returned to his seat, giving John an apologetic look as he passed. Judge Harris returned his attention to John, who was still struggling to rise from his wheelchair. Patricia stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, her face a mask of worry. "Mr. Mason," the judge began again, his voice still firm but with a barely perceptible change in tone. "Before we proceed, I'd like to ask you a question." John paused in his efforts and looked up at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. Those pins on your jacket, they appear to be military service pins. Would you mind telling the court about your service?" The question caught John off guard. He had almost forgotten about the small row of pins on his jacket lapel. He wore them not out of pride, but because Patricia had insisted. "They earned the right to be worn," she always said. "I served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, Your Honor," John replied. 3 tours in Afghanistan." Judge Harris's expression remained professional, but something flickered in his eyes. "And your injury? Was it service-related?" "Yes, sir. IED explosion outside Kabul in 2019 took out our Humvee and 2 of my friends. I was the lucky one." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Even those who had been impatiently waiting for their own cases were now fully engaged in the exchange between the disabled veteran and the stern judge. Judge Harris studied John for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a surprisingly human gesture from a man who had appeared so coldly official moments before. "Mr. Mason," he finally said, "would you be willing to tell the court more about your experience in Afghanistan?" John hesitated. He rarely talked about his time overseas, even with Patricia. The memories were still too painful, too raw. But something in the judge's tone made him reconsider. "I enlisted when I was 18, Your Honor," John began, his voice low but clear. "I was a kid from a small town who didn't have many options. The Marines gave me structure, purpose. I became a combat engineer." As John spoke, the courtroom grew increasingly quiet. The clerk stopped shuffling papers. The bailiff, who had been standing at attention by the judge's bench, relaxed his stance slightly to listen. "My first tour was in 2011. We were clearing roads of IEDs, building infrastructure, training local forces. I went back in 2015, and again in 2019. The last tour was the hardest. We lost a lot of good people." John paused, the memories washing over him. Patricia's hand tightened on his shoulder, giving him strength to continue. "The day I was injured, we were returning from a mission to help secure a school. We'd been working with local leaders to make it safe for girls to attend. Everything seemed quiet, normal. Then the world exploded." John's voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair tightly. "I don't remember much after the blast. Woke up in a field hospital with doctors telling me I was going home. Had 17 surgeries over the next 2 years. The doctor saved my legs, but I'll never walk normally again. Some days I can manage with crutches for short distances. Most days it's this chair." He finished speaking, and the courtroom remained silent. Judge Harris sat very still, his eyes never leaving John's face. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Mason, and thank you for your service." Then Judge Harris did something that stunned everyone in the courtroom. He stood up from his seat at the bench. "Mr. Mason, I owe you an apology," he said. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harris was not known for apologies. In fact, many lawyers joked that the word wasn't in his vocabulary. "I was enforcing protocol without consideration for your circumstances," the judge continued. "That was wrong of me." He stepped down from the raised platform of the bench, something he rarely did during proceedings. As he approached John's wheelchair, people in the courtroom exchanged shocked glances. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. When Judge Harris reached John, he did something even more unexpected. He stood at attention and raised his right hand in a perfect military salute. "Staff Sergeant John Mason," he said, using John's military rank that had been noted in the court file but not mentioned aloud until now. "This court respects your sacrifice and your service." John, operating on years of military training, automatically returned the salute as best he could from his seated position. It was only then that John noticed a small pin on the judge's robe, partially hidden by a fold in the black fabric. It was a Navy service pin. "You served?" John asked quietly. Judge Harris nodded. "Navy, Gulf War. Nothing like what you went through, but yes, I served." For a moment, the two men looked at each other not as judge and defendant, but as two veterans who shared an understanding that civilians could never fully comprehend. Then Judge Harris cleared his throat and straightened his robe, composing himself. But when he spoke again, his voice had lost its previous coldness. "The court recognizes that the defendant has accepted responsibility for his actions in the traffic incident," he said, loud enough for the official record. "Given the defendant's clean prior record and his distinguished service to our country, this court assesses a reduced fine of $100 and no points on his license." He looked directly at John. "Consider this a warning, Mr. Mason. Drive more carefully in the future." "Yes, sir," John replied. "I will." Judge Harris nodded, then turned to walk back to the bench. As he did, John noticed something surprising. The stern judge's eyes were glistening with tears. The bailiff, who had been watching the exchange with increasing emotion, quickly looked away and pretended to adjust his uniform. The court clerk dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even some of the spectators in the gallery were wiping away tears. Patricia wasn't even trying to hide her emotions. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she squeezed John's shoulder. "Case dismissed," Judge Harris said, his voice slightly hoarse. He banged his gavel once, then added, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." As the judge left the courtroom through his private door, John saw him reach up and quickly wipe his eyes. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversations as people discussed what they had just witnessed. A few people approached John to shake his hand or pat him on the back. The court reporter smiled at him through her tears. "What just happened?" John asked Patricia, as she helped him navigate his wheelchair toward the exit. "What happened?" she said, smiling through her tears. "Is that you reminded everyone in this room what true courage looks like." News of what happened in courtroom 3 spread quickly. By the time John and Patricia reached the courthouse lobby, several people were already talking about the exchange between the disabled veteran and the normally stern judge. A few nodded respectfully as John wheeled past them. "I think you've become famous," Patricia said with a small smile as she pushed open the heavy door that led outside. John shook his head. "I just want to go home." But as they reached the ramp where Ryan was waiting with his SUV, a man hurried toward them, slightly out of breath. He was in his 30s, dressed in khaki pants and a button-down shirt with a press badge clipped to his pocket. "Mr. Mason?" the man called. "I'm Greg Wilson from the County Herald. I was in the courtroom just now. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" John looked at Patricia uncertainly. She gave a small shrug, leaving the decision to him. I'm not sure what there is to talk about, John replied cautiously. Greg Wilson smiled eagerly. What happened in there was remarkable. Judge Harris is known for being one of the strictest judges in the county. In 5 years of covering the courts, I've never seen him apologize to anyone, let alone step down from the bench during proceedings. John shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. He was just showing respect to a fellow veteran. It wasn't a big deal. But it is a big deal, Greg insisted. It's a story about respect, about recognition of sacrifice. Would you be willing to share your story? It might help other veterans who are struggling to be seen and acknowledged. John was about to refuse when he caught sight of an older man in a wheelchair near the courthouse entrance. The man wore a Vietnam veteran cap and was struggling to navigate the heavy door. 2 people walked past him without offering help. Something in that sight made John reconsider. Maybe his story could make a difference, even in a small way. All right, John said finally. But not here. I've had enough of this courthouse for one day. They agreed to meet at a small cafe near John and Patricia's home the next morning. Ryan drove them home, and John was quiet for most of the journey, lost in thought about the day's events. That evening, as Patricia prepared dinner, the phone rang. John was surprised to hear Alan Peters, the attorney who had tried to intervene in the courtroom, on the other end. Mr. Mason, I hope you don't mind me calling. The court clerk gave me your number. Not at all, John replied. I appreciate what you tried to do today. Actually, that's why I'm calling, Alan said. Judge Harris has asked to meet with you privately, tomorrow, if possible. John was stunned. The judge wants to meet with me. Why? He didn't say exactly, but I think today's events affected him deeply. He canceled his afternoon docket, something I've never known him to do in all my years practicing law. After discussing it with Patricia, John agreed to the meeting. Alan arranged for it to take place at the judge's chambers at 10 a.m. the following day. That night, John slept poorly. The day's emotions and the unexpected attention had stirred up memories he usually kept buried. He dreamed of Afghanistan, the WIA, dust, the heat, the constant tension, and finally the explosion that had changed his life forever. He woke at dawn, sweating and disoriented. Patricia found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Bad night? She asked softly, knowing the signs. John nodded. Just old ghosts. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders from behind, resting her chin on top of his head. I'm proud of you, you know, for yesterday, for agreeing to tell your story. I'm not sure what good it will do, John said. More than you think, Patricia replied. Now let's get you ready to meet the judge. Ryan drove them to the courthouse again, but this time the experience was very different. They were met at the entrance by Alan Peters, who led them through a side door that avoided the public areas. The hallways were quieter here, with carpeted floors and wood-paneled walls lined with portraits of former judges. They stopped at a heavy oak door with a brass nameplate. Judge Samuel Harris. Alan knocked, and a deep voice called, "Enter." Judge Harris's chambers were spacious but not lavish. Bookshelves filled with law books lined the walls. Framed diplomas and certificates hung behind a large desk. But what caught John's eye were the photographs on a side table. The judge in a Navy uniform, much younger but still recognizable, standing on the deck of a ship. Judge Harris rose as they entered. He was dressed more casually today in a button-down, shirt and slacks, his judicial robe hanging on a coat rack in the corner. Mr. Mason, Mrs. Mason, thank you for coming, he said, his manner much warmer than it had been in the courtroom. Please make yourselves comfortable. He gestured to a seating area with a sofa and armchairs. John positioned his wheelchair next to one of the armchairs where Patricia sat. Alan took another chair, while Judge Harris sat across from them. I wanted to speak with you away from the formality of the courtroom, Judge Harris began. What happened yesterday has been on my mind all night. John nodded but remained silent, unsure of what to say. I've been a judge for nearly 3 decades, Judge Harris continued. In that time, I've developed certain rigidities. Protocols and procedures became more important to me than the people they were meant to serve. Yesterday, you reminded me of something I had forgotten. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. When I served in the Navy during the Gulf War, I was a legal officer. I dealt with regulations and military justice. I never saw combat like you did, but I understood the brotherhood of service. Judge Harris leaned forward slightly, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine regret. When I saw you in that wheelchair yesterday, I should have immediately recognized and respected your sacrifice. Instead, I clung to courtroom protocol. For that, I am truly sorry. The sincerity in the judge's voice was unmistakable. John found himself nodding in acceptance of the apology. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said simply. "Samuel, please. We're not in court now." This small gesture of informality seemed to break the tension in the room. For the next hour, the two men talked, not as judge and defendant, but as two veterans with shared experiences of service, sacrifice, and the challenges of returning to civilian life. Judge Harris spoke of his own struggles, adjusting after his naval service, how the structured environment of the courtroom had provided him with the order he craved. John shared more about his recovery, the nightmares that still plagued him, and the daily challenges of his disability. Patricia and Alan contributed occasionally to the conversation, but mostly they watched in amazement as these two very different men found common ground. Finally, Judge Harris straightened in his chair, his expression becoming more serious but still warm. "Mr. Mason, John, I didn't ask you here just to apologize. I asked you here because I want to propose something." He explained that for years he had been concerned about how veterans were treated in the justice system. Many struggled with PTSD, substance abuse, or other issues related to their service. The regular courts weren't equipped to address these unique challenges. "I've been thinking about establishing a veterans treatment court in our county," Judge Harris said. "A specialized court that would focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment for veterans who find themselves in legal trouble. But I've faced resistance from the county commissioners who control the budget." His eyes lit up with a new determination. "Yesterday's events have given me an idea. The story of what happened in my courtroom could help change minds. With your permission, I'd like to use our encounter as an example of why we need to better serve our veterans in the justice system." John was surprised by the request. "You want to use our story?" "Only with your full approval," Judge Harris assured him. "But yes, I believe it could make a difference. People respond to stories more than statistics, and your story is powerful." John glanced at Patricia, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I have an interview with a reporter later today," John said. "He wants to write about what happened yesterday. Maybe that could help too." Judge Harris smiled, the first real smile John had seen from him. "I think it very well might." As they prepared to leave, Judge Harris reached out to shake John's hand. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant Mason, both in Afghanistan and here at home. What you endured there and what you continue to face every day, it matters, and it should be recognized." John gripped the judge's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. Your service matters too." As they left the judge's chambers, John felt a strange sense of purpose that had been missing since his medical discharge from the Marines. What had begun as a simple traffic ticket had somehow opened a door to something meaningful. Patricia seemed to read his thoughts. "You're going to help him with this veterans court, aren't you?" she asked as they headed toward the cafe to meet Greg Wilson. "I think I am," John replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I think I am." The county herald's office was busier than John had expected. Phones rang constantly, and people hurried back and forth carrying papers and coffee cups. Greg Wilson led John and Patricia through the maze of desks to a small conference room in the back. "Sorry about the noise," Greg said as he closed the door, muffling the newsroom sounds. "It's always like this before deadline." John positioned his wheelchair at the table, while Patricia sat beside him. Greg placed a recorder between them. "Do you mind if I record our conversation?" he asked. "It helps me get the quotes right." John nodded his agreement, and Greg pressed the record button. For the next hour, John told his story. His years in the Marines, the explosion that changed his life, and his encounter with Judge Harris. Greg listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly letting John speak at his own pace. "What was going through your mind when the judge told you to stand?" Greg asked. John thought for a moment. At first, embarrassment, then anger. In the Marines, I was taught to respect authority but also to stand up for myself. It was a conflict. "And when he saluted you?" "That was unexpected," John said, his voice softening. "In that moment, he wasn't seeing my disability. He was seeing my service. That matters." Greg nodded, scribbling notes even though the recorder was running. "And I understand you met with Judge Harris privately today?" John explained about the judge's idea for a veterans treatment court and his request for John's help. Greg's eyes lit up with interest. "This is even better than I thought," he said enthusiastically. "Mind if I include that in the article? It gives the story a forward-looking angle. Not just what happened, but what's going to happen because of it." "That's fine," John agreed. "If it helps other veterans, I'm all for it." As they were wrapping up, Greg's editor, a woman named Diane, poked her head into the conference room. "How's the veteran story coming?" she asked. Greg gave her a thumbs up. "It's gold, front-page material." Diane looked at John with interest. "Would you be willing to let us take your photograph for the article? Our photographer, Joe, is available now." John hesitated. He had never sought attention for his service or his disability. But Patricia squeezed his hand encouragingly. "It's for a good cause," she reminded him quietly. "All right," John agreed. Joe the photographer turned out to be a fellow veteran who had served in Iraq. This made John more comfortable as Joe positioned him near a window where the light was good. They took several photos, including one with John, holding the Marine Corps pin from his jacket. "When will the article be published?" Patricia asked as they were preparing to leave. "Tomorrow's edition," Greg replied. "I'll make sure copies are delivered to your home." That night, John slept better than he had in months. There was something liberating about having shared his story, about feeling that his experience might help others. The nightmares that usually haunted him stayed away. The next morning, Ryan arrived early with several copies of the County Herald tucked under his arm. His face was split with a huge grin. "You're famous, buddy," he said, handing the paper to John. There it was on the front page. "Judge and disabled veteran share powerful courtroom moment." The photograph showed John in his wheelchair, looking directly at the camera with quiet dignity. The article began with a vivid description of the courtroom scene, then expanded to include John's military service and Judge Harris's vision for a veterans treatment court. "Greg did a good job," Patricia said as she read over John's shoulder. "He captured everything perfectly." The phone began ringing shortly after 8 o'clock. First, it was Alan Peters congratulating John on the article. Then Judge Harris called, his voice animated with excitement. "The article is excellent," he said. "I've already received calls from 2 county commissioners who want to discuss the Veterans Court idea. This is exactly the push we needed." But the calls didn't stop there. Throughout the day, John heard from former Marine buddies who had seen the article online, from neighbors offering support, and even from strangers who had been moved by his story. Most surprising was a call from Captain Frank Rodriguez, John's former commanding officer. "Mason, you old dog," the familiar voice boomed through the phone. "Making headlines now, are you?" "Just trying to stay out of trouble, sir," John replied, falling easily into the old pattern of respect. "Well, you're doing something important," Rodriguez said, his tone turning serious. "Too many of our brothers and sisters come home and feel forgotten. Stories like yours remind people what service really means." By late afternoon, John was emotionally exhausted from all the calls. He wheeled himself out to the back porch of their small house, seeking a few moments of quiet. Patricia joined him, bringing 2 glasses of iced tea. "Quite a day," she said, handing him a glass. John nodded, looking out at their modest backyard where Patricia had planted a vegetable garden. "I never expected any of this." "You've spent 5 years trying to adjust to civilian life," Patricia said gently. "Maybe this is the purpose you've been looking for." Before John could respond, his phone rang again. He was tempted not to answer, but the caller ID showed it was Judge Harris. "John, I hope I'm not disturbing you," the judge said when John answered. "But something important has come up. The mayor has called an emergency meeting of the county commissioners for tomorrow morning to discuss the Veterans Court proposal. She's asked if you would attend to share your perspective." John was surprised. "The mayor read the article too?" "Everyone has read it," Judge Harris replied. "It's been shared thousands of times online. People are calling it a wake-up call about how we treat our veterans." After the call, John sat quietly for a long time. Patricia waited patiently, knowing he was processing. "I never wanted to be the face of anything," John finally said. "In the Marines, it was about the team, not the individual." "This is still about the team," Patricia pointed out. "It's about all the veterans who need help but don't know how to ask for it. You can be their voice." The next morning, John found himself in the county administration building, facing the 7 county commissioners, the mayor, and several other officials. The room was packed with spectators and media representatives. Greg Wilson gave John a thumbs up from the press section. Judge Harris spoke first, outlining his proposal for the Veterans Treatment Court. He explained how it would work, providing specialized services for veterans dealing with PTSD, substance abuse, and other service-related issues that often led to legal troubles. "The goal is rehabilitation, not punishment," he emphasized. "These men and women served our country. Now, it's time for us to serve them." Then it was John's turn to speak. As he wheeled himself to the microphone, he felt a flutter of nerves. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, but when he looked around the room, he saw faces filled with respect and genuine interest. These people wanted to hear what he had to say. "My name is John Mason," he began simply. "5 years ago, I was serving as a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps in Afghanistan when an IED explosion changed my life forever." He spoke briefly about his injuries, his struggles with rehabilitation, and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. He talked about the loneliness many veterans feel, the sense of being forgotten after their service ends. "What happened in Judge Harris's courtroom the other day wasn't just about me," John continued, his voice growing stronger. "It was about recognition, about seeing the person, not just the disability, about respecting service and sacrifice." He looked directly at the commissioners. A veterans court would show that same recognition and respect to every veteran who walks through its doors. It would say, "We see you, we understand, and we're here to help." When John finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. Then someone began to applaud, and soon everyone was standing, applauding loudly. John noticed that several people, including the mayor, were wiping away tears. After the applause died down, the commissioners asked questions about costs, logistics, and implementation timelines. Judge Harris answered most of these, occasionally, turning to John for input on the veteran's perspective. Finally, the mayor called for a vote. One by one, each commissioner voted yes to establish and fund the Veterans Treatment Court as a pilot program for 1 year. As the meeting adjourned, people crowded around John to shake his hand and thank him. A middle-aged woman approached, with tears in her eyes. "My son came back from Iraq 3 years ago," she said. "He's been struggling ever since. He got into trouble with the law last month. Nothing violent, just a mistake. This court might be exactly what he needs." John took her hand. "Give him my number. Veteran to veteran, sometimes it's easier to talk." As John and Patricia left the building, reporters called out questions and cameras flashed. John felt overwhelmed but also strangely at peace. For the first time since his injury, he felt like he was making a difference again. "So," Patricia said, as they reached Ryan's waiting car, "still think that traffic ticket was bad luck?" John smiled and shook his head. "I guess sometimes life takes you exactly where you need to go, even if the road gets a little bumpy along the way." 6 months passed quickly. The Veterans Treatment Court went from an idea to reality with remarkable speed. John found himself deeply involved in the process, serving on the advisory committee that helped shape the court's policies and procedures. Every Tuesday and Thursday, John visited the courthouse to observe the progress. Judge Harris presided over the court, but he was almost unrecognizable from the stern, protocol-obsessed judge who had once ordered John to stand. In the Veterans Court, he removed his formal robe, addressed veterans by their first names, and listened with genuine concern to their stories. On a bright autumn morning, John wheeled himself into the courthouse for a special occasion, the first graduation ceremony for veterans who had successfully completed the court's program. The small courtroom was packed with people. Family members of the graduating veterans filled the gallery. Representatives from various veterans organizations stood along the walls. Patricia sat in the front row, saving a spot for John beside her. As he positioned his wheelchair in the space, he noticed a familiar face a few rows back. Greg Wilson from the County Herald, notebook in hand. "Still following the story?" John asked with a smile. Greg nodded. "From beginning to end. My editor says the Veterans Court series has generated more reader response than anything we've published in years." Before they could talk further, the bailiff called out, "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Harris entered. Everyone except John and another wheelchair-bound veteran in the gallery. The judge nodded to them respectfully as he took his seat. "Please, be seated," Judge Harris said, and the room settled. "Today is not about formalities or protocols. Today is about celebration." The judge's face broke into a wide smile as he looked out at the 5 veterans seated in a row before him. These men and women had entered the program with various legal troubles: DUIs, drug possession, disorderly conduct, all stemming from struggles with PTSD, substance abuse, or the difficult transition to civilian life. 6 months ago, we began an experiment, Judge Harris said. We asked whether a court that truly understood the unique challenges facing our veterans could make a difference. Today, we have our answer. He gestured to the 5 veterans. These individuals have completed every requirement of the program. They've attended therapy, maintained sobriety, secured employment or education, and reconnected with their communities. They've done the hard work of healing. One by one, Judge Harris called each veteran forward. He presented them with certificates of completion and a special coin that symbolized their journey. There were tears, hugs, and loud applause for each graduate. The final graduate was a young woman named Lisa, who had served as an Army medic in Iraq. When she first entered the program, she had been facing jail time for a DUI and drug possession. Lisa has not only completed all program requirements, Judge Harris announced, but she is also enrolled in nursing school, where she's maintaining a 4.0 GPA. She's turning her military medical experience into a civilian career that will help others. The room erupted in applause as Lisa accepted her certificate, wiping tears from her eyes. After all the graduates had been recognized, Judge Harris looked toward John. "We have one more special presentation today," he said. "None of this would have been possible without the inspiration and dedication of Staff Sergeant John Mason." John was surprised as Judge Harris motioned for him to come forward. Patricia gave his shoulder an encouraging squeeze. As John wheeled himself to the front of the courtroom, Judge Harris came down from the bench to meet him. The judge held a wooden plaque. "On behalf of the county, the court, and every veteran who will benefit from this program, we present this recognition to Staff Sergeant John Mason," Judge Harris said, handing John the plaque. "Your willingness to share your story and to help build this program has created a legacy that will help veterans for years to come." John was momentarily speechless as he accepted the plaque. He hadn't expected any recognition. He looked out at the faces watching him, the proud graduates, their relieved families, Patricia with tears in her eyes, and dozens of others who had supported the Veterans Court from the beginning. "Thank you," John said simply. "But this was never about me. This is about all of us recognizing that our veterans deserve a second chance when they stumble. They've earned it." After the ceremony, a reception was held in the courthouse lobby. People gathered around tables of refreshments, talking and laughing. The mood was celebratory, a stark contrast to the usual tension that filled the courthouse. John found himself approached by one person after another. A county commissioner wanted to discuss expanding the program. A veteran's wife thanked him through tears for helping her husband find his way back. One of the graduates asked if John would be his mentor for other veterans entering the program. As the crowd began to thin, John noticed Judge Harris standing alone near a window, watching. the interactions with a satisfied expression. John wheeled over to join him. "Quite a success," John said, nodding toward the graduates who were still talking with their families. Judge Harris nodded. "More than I hoped for. The recidivism rate for our first group is 0. Not one has reoffended. Compare that to the regular court system, where it's close to 50%. What happens next?" John asked. "The state has taken notice," Judge Harris replied. "They're sending representatives next month to observe our procedures. There's talk of establishing similar courts in every county." The judge looked down at John with genuine respect. "And I have you to thank for it." John shook his head. "We both know it would never have happened if you hadn't been willing to admit a mistake that day in court. Not many judges would have done that." "Not many would have," Judge Harris agreed with a small smile. "But then I wasn't always a judge. Once I was just a sailor trying to serve my country, same as you." As the reception wound down, Patricia joined them. She had been talking with Lisa, the Army medic turned nursing student. "Lisa has invited us to her graduation next year," Patricia said. "She says she wouldn't be there without this program." Judge Harris checked his watch. "I hate to end this, but I have a meeting with the State Judicial Committee in 20 minutes. As the judge turned to leave, John called after him. "Samuel?" Judge Harris turned back, eyebrows raised at the use of his first name. "Remember that day in court when you told me to stand?" John asked. The judge nodded, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "I've been thinking about that moment a lot," John continued. "At the time, it felt like just another example of the world. Not seeing me, not understanding, but now I realize, if that hadn't happened, none of this would exist." John gestured around at the courthouse that now housed the Veterans Treatment Court. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes." Judge Harris considered this, then nodded slowly. "A wise perspective, Staff Sergeant." After the judge left, John and Patricia made their way toward the courthouse exit. As they passed through the lobby, John noticed something he hadn't seen before, a new plaque on the wall beside the directory of courtrooms. It read, "Veterans Treatment Court, dedicated to all who served." Outside, the autumn sun was warm on their faces. Ryan was waiting with his car, but John paused before getting in. "What is it?" Patricia asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I was just thinking about that traffic ticket," John replied with a smile. "Best mistake I ever made." As they drove home, John looked out the window at the town passing by. For years after his injury, he had felt lost without purpose or direction. His identity had been so tied to being a Marine that when that was taken away, he hadn't known who he was anymore. Now he knew. He was still a man who served. The battlefield had changed, but the mission remained the same, to help his fellow veterans, to make sure no one was left behind. 1 year to the day after that fateful court appearance, John sat in the audience as the Veterans Treatment Court celebrated its anniversary. The program had expanded to serve 30 veterans at a time. 3 other counties had established similar courts based on their model, and Judge Samuel Harris had been recognized with a national award for judicial innovation. When John's name was mentioned during the ceremony, he received a standing ovation. As applause filled the room, he caught Judge Harris's eye across the crowd. The judge, who had once commanded him to stand, now stood for him instead, along with everyone else in the room. In that moment, John felt something he hadn't felt since before his injury, a sense of standing tall, regardless of whether his legs could support him. It wasn't about physical ability. It was about standing for something that mattered. And that, John realized, was the greatest healing of all.